Is there a limit to how much you can take? And if there is, do you know what that limit is? Well, today on Daily Renewal, we're going to be talking about what it takes to follow Jesus. Hello everybody, this is Pastor Lyle and welcome to Daily Renewal. The question I have for you today, the session is titled, Can I Follow? You know, I think that all of us from time to time, we go through stages of life where our relationship with God is tested to the point where we go, can I follow? Is there a limit is there a point where you say, I can't do this anymore? Well, the great part about this is that there's been many men and women that have gone on before us, and every once in a while, and we see this in the scripture, but even through history, people that have gone through situations that are way tougher than ours, and yet when they've relied on Christ, He's been able to bring them through. And in the times where maybe some of them ended with death, their deaths always seemed to magnify the Lord to the point where they did not die in vain. Now in the church today, you don't see a lot of people in North America that are persecuted for their faith. I mean, we see some forms of persecution. And in fact, if you study this out, you'll find out that there's more Christian persecution going on in the world right now than in the entire history of Christianity. But often in North America, we don't hear much about it. It's not preached much in the churches. I know in our church, we try to pray for churches around the world that are suffering for the sake of the gospel because it's happening. But in North America, we don't feel a lot of persecution unto death. And as a result, I think that we have to be very careful because the church can become very weak without persecution. I'm not necessarily praying that we have more of it, but I think today when it comes to can I follow, there's a lot of things that when people are confronted with, we find out they can't follow. And some of these things we see in the form of when people come against our rights. And one of the guys that I think that exemplified how this needs to be done is Peter. Now, when we look at Peter, I'm going to be honest, in some of the stories that I show you, his leader was Jesus. Some of the things that Jesus did with Peter and how he treated him, I'm going to tell you right now, if Jesus was the pastor in some of the churches today and he treated parishioners the same way that he treated Peter, there's a lot of people that would not be coming to church. They would say, I don't think Jesus is being very fair. And this is not about being fair. If you're a parent, then you know that there's times where you have to be strong with your children. If you don't discipline your children, sometimes you're a bit hard with your children because you want them to learn things. If you're easy on them, a lot of times it actually isn't helping them. And there was times where Jesus did things with Peter that in today's culture it would have looked at as being not acceptable. So let's take a look at some of those things. The first one is on the Mount of Transfiguration. We find this in Luke 9. Peter's up, and Peter gets to be, he's one of the three. He's one of Jesus' right-hand guys. He's one of the closest people to Jesus. And they're up on a mountain, and all of a sudden there's a visitation of God, and the disciples were asleep, or the three of them that were there. They all of a sudden wake up, and we pick up the story in verse 33 of chapter 9, and it says this. Then it happened, as they were parting from him, that Peter said to Jesus, Master, it is good for us to be here. And let us make 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah, not knowing what he said. And I'll stop there. Now, if this was the church today, Peter, wow, here's a leader. This is the kind of guy we want. This is the forward thinking that we want. He's looking to honor the leader. And so, in today's church, this would be somebody that, he took a step up, he took a step of faith, and here he is. He's doing it the way we want it done. He's thinking out of the box. And so what does Jesus do? He promotes him. No, actually, that's not what he did. You want to know what Jesus did? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. There's no indication that he even responded. You know what my observation often is? Somebody comes up and they got a great idea that they think's a God idea. If I was to not respond, most people, they'd leave immediately. People get so offended if you just don't answer their great ideas. But here's one with Peter. He thinks he's coming up with this great, profound idea, and Jesus doesn't even respond. Wow. So the second thing we see here, we're going to look at Matthew 14. And I mean, this story's in a couple places. But we see that Jesus sends the disciples across the lake. He doesn't go with them. And then at night, he comes at them walking on water, and they get scared. And then Peter looks at him and says, Lord, if it's you, command me to come out to you on the water. And so here he is. Peter stands up out of all of them, and he's bold enough. All the rest of them sitting in the boat, but he's bold enough to rise up and say something like that. So Jesus says, come on out. And so he actually gets out of the boat and begins to walk on water. And then that's where the fun begins, and we pick it up in verse 30. It says this, but when he saw the wind was boisterous, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, Lord, save me. And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him and said to him, O you of little faith, why did you doubt? Whoa, in the church today, you can't do that. Somebody like Peter, who's risen up and gone beyond in serving and helping, and then all of a sudden, the leader looks at him and says, where's your faith? He embarrassed him in front of all of his peers by asking him where his faith was, rather than saying, why didn't you at least encourage him? Didn't you see Jesus? He actually took a few steps on the water. He was the only one bold enough to make a difference, to get out of the boat. And what you did was crush him. What kind of leadership is that? What kind of pastor are you? That's what today's church would say. But how many know that Jesus knew exactly what he was doing? And again, we see that Peter kept on following. Now that brings me to the third story. Now, if this didn't blow him out of being a disciple, then this last one should have. Now let's look at what happened. I'm going to give you the background of the story, and this is in the book of Mark. Now, Jesus is sitting around with the disciples, sitting around with the closer followers to him, and he asks them. He says, who do men say that I am? And you find this around verse 27 of chapter 8 of Mark. And they respond, they say you're the prophet, a prophet. They give him these examples of who people say that he is. And then he asks them clearly, who do you say that I am? Now this is an important question, and Jesus is asking this because these are people that have hung out with him. If anybody should know who Jesus is, it's these guys. And amazingly enough, Peter rises up again. He boldly proclaims, you're the Christ. You're the Son of the living God. And immediately Jesus praises him. He says, you know what? Blessed are you, because you couldn't have known this unless it was revealed to you by the Father. Now, you have to know that amongst the disciples, this would have been a big deal to Peter, and a lot of the other disciples would have been just like, darn, Peter got that one, because they were always competing with one another. So Peter would have felt pretty good about himself because this was revealed by God, and he was the one bold enough to get it first. Well, the elation didn't last long. We pick the story up in verse 31. This is right after this happens. It says that Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he spoke the word openly. And then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when he had turned around and looked at the disciples, he rebuked Peter, saying, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not mindful of the things of God, but the things of men." Are you serious? Here's Peter again. He was just he just had this big revelation from God, and now Jesus looks back at the disciples. Again, he embarrasses Peter. At least that's how it could have been taken. Peter could have looked at this and went, in front of all my peers, you're saying to me, get behind me, Satan. Now, I've pastored a long time. I've never said to a parishioner that I could think of, get behind me, Satan. Now, we know that Jesus wasn't speaking, he was speaking to a spiritual entity that was speaking through Peter. But at this point, if this was to happen in a North American church today, guarantee Peter would not be in church next Sunday. There would be a huge offense. And so, having said that, we know that Peter kept on following. Now, I'm going to tell you why he kept on following. And we see this if we turn over to the book of John. And this is another situation where Jesus is actually preaching what may have been his last message. And he's talking about how the fact that you need to drink his blood and eat his flesh. And this didn't make sense to a lot of people. And there's a lot of times where when we're following the Lord, there's things that might not make sense to us. But the thing is, how Peter handled this is the key to why he was able to continue to follow. And it's the key on how we will be able to continue to follow as well. And we see this when we read verse 65 of chapter 6. It says, and he said, therefore I have said to you that no one can come to me unless it has been granted to him by my Father. From that time, many of Jesus' disciples went back and walked with him no more. And then Jesus said to the 12, do you also want to go away? And Simon Peter answered, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. Also, we have come to believe and know that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now, what I believe Peter was relaying here, he was in a situation where he goes, you know what, Lord, I may not understand this, but the one thing I do know is that you are God. You are God's representative. You are God's manifest in the flesh. You are exactly who you say you are. You are the Messiah. You are the one who came for my sins. I don't understand all this, but I know you are who you are. And this is the key to us following. Many left him that day. Why did they leave? Well, they couldn't comprehend it. It was too much for them because they didn't have a revelation of who he was. So for us, when it comes to the question, can I follow? The answer is, do you know who he is? And as we continue to cultivate our relationship with Jesus, he continues to reveal who he is. And our believing on him isn't based on our emotions, isn't based on whether other people are following, isn't based on our church attendance, isn't based on anything else other than the fact that we know that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And no one can come to the Father except through him. When you know that he is the way, the truth, and the life, when you know that is fact, then you can follow. Now we know that later on Peter, he denied Christ 3 times, and it talks about the fact that he wept bitterly. And I believe that even though he denied him, the part that was hard for him is that he was wrestling with this fact that he knew who Jesus was, but he saw it was weakness in himself that caused him to deny Christ. And we see how he responded when he did later on see Jesus. He's fishing. Here's Peter fishing on a boat, and he sees Jesus on the shore. And what's his reaction? He casts off his clothes and jumps in. He was so excited to come see Jesus. He knew who Jesus was. But he also realized that there was weakness within him. And for us, yes, we are frail. We don't know what it'll be like if we were ever confronted with our life or your life or Jesus. We're not in that position. But I will say this, that we have to ask the Lord, cultivate in me a relationship with you. I could be even like Peter. Peter, yes, he denied Christ 3 times, but we know from history that Peter actually was crucified. In fact, he was crucified upside down because he didn't feel worthy to be crucified the same as his Lord. He was eventually able to give up his life for Jesus without denying him, because God had done a great work in his life. And I trust that God's doing a great work in your life. Can you follow? Absolutely you can. Well, I hope you got something out of this today. I pray that you did. If you did, I just want to encourage you to share the videos with other people. Subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You can also like us on Facebook, and we're also on Twitter and Instagram. If you're in the Kamloops area, be sure to stop by River City Church. Having said that, God bless you, and have a great day.